Hey guys, how's it going? And welcome back to another video where today we're doing something a little bit different. Today we're going to be taking a look at my experience as a new player in Final Fantasy XIV in 2021, and I'm going to try to answer a question for those of us who are tempted to take the plunge. Is it good? Now, a quick note that if you enjoy this video, make sure to subscribe and leave a like and check back, as I plan to cover a lot more MMO-based content in the future. So, Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, a game that went from a relatively disastrous start to reinvent and relaunch itself and become one of the largest and most critically acclaimed MMOs to date. Before really digging into the game's specifics, I want to state that I'm truly doing this review from the context of a new player. I think that very often with this game especially, people will tell you about the end game or about the story of future expansions, but I won't be reviewing that. Because although they do look fantastic and I'm looking forward to playing them, I'm going to attempt to focus on the fabric of the game and the true experience that a new player will have, which is not content that is, 100 hours into the game, it's the first experience of the game itself. So I'm going to be talking about what kind of MMO it is, what kind of MMO it isn't, and I'm going to help you gauge whether or not this is a game for you. I'm also going to answer the main question a lot of potential players have about long-standing MMOs, and something that put me off of the game for a long time, which is the idea of, is it too late to start? This is going to be based on my first 20 to 30 hours in the game, many of which I've streamed over on my Twitch channel. If you want to check out a longer introduction to the game, you'll find a link down below. So let's start out with what Final Fantasy XIV is not. It's not an instant gratification MMO, nor is it one that cares to make things overly streamlined for the player. There's a huge breadth of content on offer that's grown over the years, and it can feel a little bit overwhelming upon entry. It's also not a PvP-centric MMO. Player versus player combat does exist in the game, but it's far from a focal point of the game's designs and intentions, and while I'm sure there is a niche community within the game who really care for it, this is, simply put, not a PvPers MMO. This is something that I had to adjust my expectations of the MMO experience to be, as traditionally I'm pretty much a 50-50 player when it comes to PvE and PvP, but if you're looking for a grindable battleground system, high-ranked arena, or something like the Realm v Realm system from Guild Wars, you're not really going to find active communities for that here. Final Fantasy XIV is also not an endgame only MMO. There are those of us out there who despise leveling and would even start at max level were the option available to us, and ignoring purchasable level skips, Final Fantasy XIV is a game that you will spend a great deal of time leveling in. This is both a positive and a negative depending on the kind of player you are, and I'm certainly going to get into the positives of this in a little bit, but if the idea of spending a long time, far longer than most MMOs, in the formative stages of your adventuring career is unappealing to you, it might not be the game for you. In fact, players who don't enjoy the leveling process may find the amount of hand-holding and the fact that almost every feature is unlocked via the main story to be very tedious to plow through. So what is Final Fantasy XIV? Well, I'm going to start out with another kind of controversial point, and one that will put some people off the game. Final Fantasy XIV is a Japanese game, which is shocking, I know, but this does come with certain elements to it that are common within the JRPGs and Asian MMO genres. Functionally, the game has dense, packed menus and UI system that does take some getting used to, and that's not to say it's bad. I actually think it's pretty good, but it definitely had a learning curve to it, and it can be quite dense and packed with information at times, and considering the lack of modding support, it actually turns out to be pretty good and usable in the end. But the UI overall is convoluted and can add to the feeling of being a little bit lost in the beginning. Now, aesthetically, it has a lot of the hallmarks of a Japanese game too. There's cat girls, there's bunny girls, the weird childlike race that almost every Asian MMO is apparently legally obligated to have. There's enough boob armor sets to please even Slaaneish's tastes, and the reality is, some people who are strongly opposed to this side of the game's look will be put off by it. Some people can't handle this kind of aesthetic, whereas some people love it. I will say, it isn't as strong as it could be, but it's certainly there. Personally, I sit somewhere between the two. I don't overly care for anime-esque style, but I do love catgirls, and oh my god, there are so many catgirls in this game, 10 out of 10. Anyway, outside of my hellbound degeneracy, the game is largely absolutely beautiful. Environments are obviously crafted with love and care, as you'd expect from the main titles in the Final Fantasy franchise, and character models and armor are undeniably a step above their largest competitors. I do think there are some exceptions to this, primarily with some of the playable races. I'd actually draw attention to the big boy Rogadin male model, especially looks strangely low detail and actually kind of out of place when side by side with some of the other playable characters. And as always, graphical taste is subjective, but Final Fantasy XIV generally really won me over in that regard. Now, most importantly, and this is where the too late to start question factors in, Final Fantasy XIV is a story-driven MMO. It's almost like a sequence of RPGs, like true Final Fantasy games tied together with an MMO wrapper than it is a pure MMO. These aren't going to be WoW quests for the most part, and as a new player, you'll largely be told that the base game is significantly weaker than its expansions. Now, from what I've seen, this holds to be true, but the following is also from what I can see so far. The game has a lot of quest text, and while some will find this their worst nightmare and be lost at sea due to spam clicking through it, the game is greatly enhanced if you just chill out a bit and take some time to read, at least in the main story questline. This gets me onto my absolute biggest warning and advertisement for the game. Final Fantasy XIV is a game that rewards patience and an understanding that the game is being true to its series origins and you are, as I said, playing an RPG. The questline will often lead you to dungeons at regular intervals, so the MMO aspect is there throughout, and it doesn't leave you feeling too stranded or like it's too solo of an experience, but you have to treat the experience as though you are playing an RPG. You wouldn't load up a single-player RPG and skip all the cutscenes on your first playthrough because it wouldn't make sense, and I think you have to adopt a similar approach to Final Fantasy XIV. Now, if you aren't down for dozens of hours of story-based content, where the more you put in, the more you get out, it's probably not the MMO for you. Similarly, it's not too late to start the game, because while the content has piled up over the years, it's one of the main points of the game and not a means to an end to accessing the end game. Writing off the game as starting too late strikes me like deciding to not play a great RPG like The Witcher because it has DLC out. That's not to say the quality so far has been Witcher-esque. My experiences in the base game have varied from thankfully recently trimmed down fetch quest boredom to incredible sequences facing off against some of the primal bosses like Ifrit. The quality is patchy so far, but when it's there, it's really there. In fact, as a brief sidebar, one of the great joys I've got out of the game so far is its reverence and its inclusion of other titles in the series. The first time I saw Ozma as a mount or somebody wearing Yuna's summoner outfit put a grin on my face, and I think fans of the main series will get an added level of joy out of the game for sure. It's packed full of references and nods to things that have come before and after 14 in the franchise, and it's going to be something that people who are in on the joke really appreciate. I think this is a classic case of you don't need to like Final Fantasy games to enjoy Final Fantasy XIV, but my god, it helps. I think players entirely unfamiliar with the franchise can still enjoy and get into the game, but a lot of the references will be lost on them. So let's talk about mechanics. It's definitely the secondary aspect of the game compared to the story for me, but it's a very important one nonetheless. Class fantasy, which is the feeling of classes being unique and immersive, is definitely there. Each class is defined by the weapon they use, and you can relatively simply swap to another class after a brief quest chain to initially gain it by just changing your weapon. This system of any class, including crafting classes or even fishing, being available by simple weapon swaps is one of the highlights of the character system to me, and there's a 100% XP boost to combat classes below your highest level job, which makes leveling up alternative styles far smoother, and it does really aid you in if you're burning out on playing your current role, so you've been tanking and you want to heal for a little bit. The XP boost and the ease of changing class without rolling a new character is such a benefit to the game. However, one slight criticism I have of the class system is how classes evolve into their more advanced counterparts at level 30. You can see me here, I was playing my archer, and when I reached level 30, I became a bard. Now, generally speaking, this is an exciting milestone in the leveling process, but some of the evolutions can be a little confusing depending on what you originally chose your class for. A good example is that somebody starting as an archer may not desire to play as a song-slinging bard, but that's the natural progression for their class. I think making this choice a little clearer to players from level 1 would be good, and for now I'd recommend checking ahead and making sure the advanced class is something that you want to play. Thankfully, this information is all pretty easily accessible online. So the combat in the game is something that I definitely took time to warm to. Players of other MMOs will feel significantly slowed down by the game's long global cooldown, or GCD, in the first steps of the game. This feeling goes away a little bit with time as you gain access to more and more off GCD abilities and spells that can be woven in between uses of your global cooldown. Initially, it starts out pretty dry and pretty slow, but there's a nice natural difficulty progression as you do begin to weave more and more abilities in. But with this not really being illustrated super early on, you may write off the combat as very slow feeling, which I did when I initially played the game many years ago. However, upon returning and again putting in more patience and more time, I've begun to realize how the combat really works, and there's actually some classes that have some pretty advanced gameplay mechanics and require some very, very crazy ability weaving. For instance, the ninja, I've been told, and I looked it up, and the ninja looks very advanced mechanically to play. So if you are the kind of person who enjoys having that in-depth rotation, that very skill-dependent performance, there is definitely gameplay here for you, although the early game will do its best to convince you otherwise. Classes also feel well varied, with an impressive amount of unique designs contained within. There's series staples like white mages and black mages, all the way to specific draws from past entries like the Gunbreaker, so yes, you can have a Gunblade from Final Fantasy VIII, and there's even some very unique classes that you generally wouldn't really see in other MMOs, which adds to the game a lot as well. You can play as things like astrologians or dancers, and speaking outside of combat classes for a moment, one thing that very economically or just very relaxingly minded players will appreciate is that all of the game's crafting professions are also their own classes that you level up separately. So there is an end game to being crafters as well. In combat, however, the game does make use of the traditional combat triangle of MMOs. There's tanks, healers, and damage dealers. But in a game with so much to learn and take in, that honestly feels like a welcome comfort to me at times. Additionally, the hardest content tiers in the game are designed around 8-player parties. Now, this departure from large-scale raid teams, which do feature in a few things, but they aren't the focal point of the hard endgame, means that fights can get extremely brutal in terms of mechanical difficulty and coordination needed. Even low level, I saw some players getting toasted by Trials abilities, and at the high end, it seems like the coordination needed is strong. Personally, I'm a big fan of this. Aspirational difficulty content is very much so appealing to me as a very goals-driven player. We'll do some miscellaneous points about the game before we get on to perhaps the most surprising point about FF14. First off, the music in this game is absolutely phenomenal and has to be mentioned. The soundtrack to this game is simply one of the best I've ever heard in any game, MMO or not. The OST is something truly to be cherished, and this is definitely a music-on experience for me. Visual effects for spells and combats can be a little bit overwhelming in the JRPG, flashy skills, lots going on sense, but this can be toned down via the options menu should it become too much. I've not reached that point yet, but I'm kind of getting there. Also, the voice acting in the base game is inconsistent to be polite and extremely bad to be rude. Most of the voice cast is actually replaced after the first base game when you enter the first expansion, so I'm kind of hopeful for things improving on that point. Now for one of the most surprising things, and this is something that I have to bring up. It's one of the things that has impacted my time in Eorzea the most so far, and that is that the community for this game is absurdly nice. Which is a shocking thing to say in 2021 about a multiplayer online experience, but seriously, every question I've asked in dungeons, every random person I've asked for help, has been so welcoming and helpful that I'm starting to suspect it's some sort of Darren Brown style mind game. New players are marked with this little sprout icon you can see next to my name in some of the footage here, and look, if a game wants to give me a please be nice to me badge, I'm not going to say no. Honestly, I think I've kind of cracked it. And I think it's some magical mix of the lack of PvP elitism, the utter patience required to play the game, and the fact that the game's length and depth of story means that most of the people who last in Final Fantasy XIV really do feel passionate about the game and are very, very keen to help new players also make sense of the game and gain that long-term passion. It's a bizarre thing, but it's absolutely true that the community in this game has been, I would go so far as to say, the most welcoming I've ever experienced outside of, maybe the Dungeons & Dragons community, and I'd be remiss to not mention it. It's been a huge boon in my experience so far. So is it good? I mean, this is a hard one to slap a yes or no on, because is it good for me, a player who does enjoy chilling out and meandering through some story piece by piece, while I also spend an unhealthy amount of time fishing? Yes, it's been propped up by the promise of challenging and well-designed endgame boss content. The world is relaxing, and honestly, the game has a sense of personality and characterization that is one of the reasons why Final Fantasy was my gateway into falling in love with games. Is it good for a die-hard MMO player looking for a game to min-max? Potentially yes, if they can make it through the long story grind, or if they can face the level skip and not knowing what's going on at all. That's a lot to pick up from ground zero, but if they can manage it, it seems to be that there's something for them there as well. However, I will say that the group it's absolutely not for is the PvP-focused player, which is a dying breed nowadays, after typically being under-catered to by MMOs for a long time. Final Fantasy XIV doesn't just under-cater to PvP, it's virtually a side mini-game. Overall, I hope this video has helped you gain a little bit of more insight into whether the game suits you or not. But if you have the patience and the desire to immerse yourself in the game's world, it seems like an obvious top MMO pick in 2021 right now. Thanks for watching as always, and one last note, come and say hi on my Twitch at twitch.tv/merchant. With how things are going, I'll probably be streaming Final Fantasy XIV. So I'll see you next time. Bye bye.